I am so honored to interview today Dr. Steve Porges, PhD, originator of the Polyvagal theory. In 1994, we met about 10 years ago in Berlin, and Steve was not only the smartest man in the room, but a delightful man, a hyper co-regulator. We're going to define those words very soon. How are you doing, Steve? You look good.
I'm doing fine, but the priorities, of course, are nice before smart. So that's what our nervous system requests, and that's what we should be looking for. And when people say, when a parent would come to me and talk about their child, and they would say, "Oh, he's so bright," I would look at them and say, "Okay, what's the problem?" Because what they're saying is that the child isn't interacting with them, but he's bright. So we, in our culture, tend to emphasize intelligence and not the ability to co-regulate each other, literally to interact and be part of each other's feedback loops. And so for the next few minutes, I hope we are reclaiming our co-regulatory relationship.
Absolutely. We're going to neuromodulate each other, and we're going to make sure that we are nice before being smart is a biological requirement. Correct?
Yes.
So, but he's not just nice. Steve is also a distinguished university scientist at Indiana University. That's where you are right now, right? In Indiana?
Yeah. Well, I'm not in Indiana now. I mean, I hold the appointment there, and I hold an appointment of professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and a professor emeritus in psychiatry at the University of Illinois, and emeritus as professor of human development at University of Maryland. This is where longevity works.
So you served as president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research. And as we know, you are an acclaimed international speaker, and you have published probably more than 300 peer-reviewed papers across numerous disciplines. And I print your resume a bit on YouTube. It'll be easier. So I know you hate that question. What is the polyvagal theory? So could you talk about maybe your personal journey, your inquiry as a child? I know it was very interesting for you.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's go back to the question I hate the most, which is what is polyvagal theory? Because over time, I basically distill it in different ways to tell a different story. And from a world perspective, from a human in the world, and this is who we are, the theory tells us that the physiological state we're in biases how we react to the world. And this means how I react to you, and even how I might react to a pathogen or a physical injury. So we tend to think in our world, our Western world, that life is all about cause and effect, and science is about identifying laws of cause and effect. But we forget about the intervening variable, the organism between the stimulus and the response, between the cause and the effect. Polyvagal theory emphasizes that intervening variable. So if there's one take-home message, and that is we need to spend more time studying the neural state of the patient or our subjects if we're researchers, because that information enables us to make better predictions about how they'll react to the interventions and the stimulation that we use, including educational context and social context.
So you mean the inner state rather than the event?
Yeah. I think when we use the word inner state, we're talking about intervening physiological state, or really the neural physiological state. Our nervous system is regulating our body, and that body can be, quote, safe and accessible, or it can be defensive. And when it's safe and accessible, on an autonomic nervous system side of the world, we're supporting health, growth, and restoration, homeostatic functions. But we're also creating a neural platform for higher brain structures to efficiently and effectively work, meaning we're smarter when we're calmer. We're smarter when we're social. We're smarter when we're nice.
We should be really smart right now. So let me review that, because maybe I'll do it for you and as a good student, and you tell me where I'm wrong. So the polyvagal, used. I remember you were inspired by Jackson theory of dissolution, when the older system it's a passive defense in front of trauma. It's an unmyelinated vagus. We call it the dorsal vagus because it's controlled by the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. We're in the brainstem. After that, we evolve vertebrate, evolve sympathetic system.
A spinal sympathetic nervous system paralleling the spine. Yeah.
So we're the reptile, the passive system, dorsal vagus. We have the cartilaginous fish with the dorsal sympathetic system. And then the primate evolved with the
we don't even have to go to primates. We can say mammals had this capacity to have this ventral vagal circuit that was now constrained and enabled the sympathetics and the dorsal vagus to do their job to support health, growth, and restoration without moving into states of defense. So we get confused. We think that the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. No, sympathetic nervous system is exuberance, excitement, it's joy, but it can turn into aggressive behavior. And the constraint that keeps it out of aggression and makes it playful and interactive is the ventral vagus. The ventral vagus is wired to an area of the brainstem regulating the muscles of the face and head, meaning intonation of voice, which is a vagal nerve, as for laryngeal and pharyngeal, facial expression, which is not a vagal nerve, but is regulated in the brainstem in a column that's called, basically, it's the special visceral efferent pathways that come from 5 cranial nerves. That's a column that really evolved to regulate the structures that came from the ancient gill arches. And so they're very much involved with pulling oxygen in. So the interesting part of life is about we become more efficient in our oxygen utilization when we are social and calm. When we become under states of defense, we are metabolically very costly organisms. So evolution provided us with this wonderful tool, which we could call social interaction, which enabled us to calm down, to facilitate health, growth, and restoration. And I would say the problem in modern medicine and in modern lifestyle is that we think behavior is intentional and unaffected by our physiological state. And we tend not to listen to our bodies, and our bodies are giving us all the clues. It's telling us, is our physiology supporting health, growth, or restoration? And when it does, guess what? I feel safe. I feel engaging. If my body's in a state of threat, it's going to use my resources to protect me, not to interact and not to explore and not to create.
So you see, you're already talking about it. As soon as I started, you took over. So we have the newest system, social interaction, ventral vagus, myelinated vagus, nucleus ambiguous, brainstem. Then we go down into a more active defense in case of stress with sympathetic system, but it could be exuberance and happiness and playfulness.
Yeah. If the ventral is still regulating. So if we look at children playing, the secret's given to us. They're moving just like you do in fight and flight, but they're making facial expressions at each other and they're speaking to each other with melodic voices. You know if they're fighting or if they're playing by listening to their voice. And the secret of that from let's say an astute clinician or a clinical researcher is an understanding that the intonation of voice is regulated by the vagus. The pharyngeal and laryngeal nerves are vagal, and they're basically paralleling the vagal influence to the heart. So when a person has this melodic voice that we feel safe and comfortable or enjoying, they're really broadcasting their physiological state in their voice.
Face to face, upper part of the face, orbicularis oris. Also the hearing, dampening.
The middle ear muscles. Again, this is an area that few people ever look at. But the secret of the importance of the middle ear structures is really a story of evolution, because when mammals evolved from reptiles, the middle ear bones broke off the jawbone. Now, that enabled them to hear airborne frequencies at higher ranges than reptiles. So when you see a snake in the path, you don't say, there's a snake in the path. You say, there's a snake, high pitch. And monkeys do that and other mammals when they see snakes. And because if you are in that higher frequency band, the snake can't hear you. So Darwin noticed that. So the point is the difference between being able to hear sounds and listening. So the nerves that regulate those middle ear muscles basically they regulate the ossicles, the smallest bones. They regulate the smallest muscles in the body.
Cranial nerve 5 and 7, right? Cranial nerve 5 and 7.
Right. It's the tensor tympani and the stapedius, the two smallest muscles in the body. What they do is they make the ossicle chain of the three smallest bones in the body stiff. And what that does is it tightens the eardrum. And when you tighten the eardrum, it's like a timpani, a kettle drum. Low frequency sounds will bounce off and human voice will come in.
And hyperacusia, right? You hear those.
Well, you have hyperacusis, which is probably a misnomer. It's probably a wrong word for it, because it's not only sensitivity to sound, it's being overwhelmed by low frequency sounds, which means that eardrum is not bouncing, not tight enough to bounce low frequencies away. And what happens is that you have paradoxical problems. You hear low frequency sounds with better than normal, but you can't hear human voice. Human voice gets lost in background. And if you work in a world with individuals who have adversity histories like trauma, and they tell you about going into restaurants or going to places, they can't hear what people are saying, but they're astutely aware of those lower frequency background sounds. Autistic children have the same features. They hear better than normal low frequency, but they can't understand a word you're saying at times.
Yeah, absolutely. So ventral vagus, sympathetic, and then dorsal vagus.
Yeah.
And I remember the question I asked you in 2012, because the heart is innervated by the nucleus ambiguus, the vagus, and the dorsal nucleus.
Yeah.
And so I thought the separation was at the heart, but you said no, it's at the diaphragm. That's what.
Well, the term, the difference between generalization. Now we're going to say that in general, the dorsal vagus regulates organs below the diaphragm. It's primarily our subdiaphragmatic vagus, and the nucleus ambiguus is primarily our supradiaphragmatic organs above the diaphragm. This does not mean that 100% of the nerves are going above or below. It's just the predominance. And this becomes of interest because there are dorsal vagal pathways going to the heart's pacemaker. But in general, they're dormant. And this was part of the hypotheses of the polyvagal theory, was about when are they no longer dormant. And that was following the rules of Hewlings-Jackson, which was dissolution. And you can see this in the intensive care unit with newborns and even with adults, that once that ventral vagus is depressed, which happens in fever or prematurity, or let's say difficult deliveries, the heart becomes tachycardic, which means it's moving into this state of hyperactivity. It's sympathetically dominated, but more than that, it's metabolically costly. So it's in a sense in a state of chronic threat and is trying to mobilize to get out of that. But the body is in itself, that metabolic demand is time limited. You can't maintain it. So the body has its own feedback loops, and then it will start shutting itself down. And that's turning on these older dorsal vagal cardioinhibitory fibers. Now you have to understand that the older vertebrates, the more primitive ones, including reptiles, what is one of their major defense modes? To basically stop breathing, lower their heart rate, immobilize. But the size of their cortex, even in reptiles, is very, very small. And if you start going into fish, the size of the entire brain is very small. And so they can literally not breathe for hours without damage. Humans don't have that luxury, and even other mammals don't have that luxury. So like a mouse that is being challenged by a cat might literally appear to be dead, going to the shutting down response, but it's going to be time limited, because if it's not time limited, the mouse will die. So we have these, in a sense, time constants or loops that our nervous system is reading. But we have on board some of these ancient tools of shutting down. The problem that I see is that as a species, we evolved to very easily move out, take the ventral vagus off, mobilize, go into fight, flight, go into threat, and then to re-engage with a safe person and calm down, like a baby crying and the mother calming down. I think we're, in a sense, efficient and literally miraculous in how we can go back and forth for those things. The issue is, yeah.
No, I was thinking you don't want someone to be always in ventral. You want this mobility, the adaptation, this movement between
the movement, but the issue is you don't want to put the ventral to make it dormant. The ventral, when you turn it off, is giving permission, literally opening up the gate, giving permission to allow the sympathetics to express themselves unimpeded, uncontrolled, unconstrained. We want to live in a life where we can recruit a lot of our metabolic resource, meaning with sympathetic activity, but not at the expense of telling our ventral vagus it's not wanted. Yes. It in a sense it can take a rest, but we want it to come back. It's like you're the sprinter, you're running fast, and you're giving your body permission to literally get all that metabolic output. But when you stop running, you want this friendly part of you to come back to take care of you, so that you're safe in the presence of others. Because if you don't get that ventral vagus back on, you are not going to feel safe with others. You can't, in a sense, fulfill that feedback loop.
Yeah. If you are in chronic dorsal, I imagine that's going to be the root of many digestive problems. And
yeah, so let's go there for a moment, because we cannot survive in chronic dorsal, but we can use dorsal. Oh, first of all, dorsal is when it's constrained by the ventral vagus, in a sense, when it's not allowed or given permission to go into defense. It supports our enteric nervous system, our gut. In a sense, our gut's important, and it's the relationship between the ventral vagus and the subdiaphragmatic gut is that the ventral vagus gives the enteric nervous system permission to do its own self-regulation. But when we are under a state of threat and that ventral vagus is retracted, the sympathetics tell the enterics to do something else. It says turn off. So you find out you get constipation under chronic stress or threat. Then, like other forms of sympathetic overload, the body says, can't do that, it's too costly. So then it goes into a dorsal vagus compensatory response. And that is metabolically, everything kind of slows up. We pass out. But in the gut, it results in diarrhea and gut problems. So in the world, again, the weird world that we live in, this chronic, stressful or threat-oriented world, the gut is really taking a lot of abuse, and especially children, where they have gut problems all the time. And what that is telling you is that under certain situations, their body interprets the context as a life threat. So when a child doesn't want to go to school because their gut hurts, as a parent who wants to get the kid out of the house, you say, oh, it will be fine. But that child is really telling you something about their experience in that environment.
I think I never shared that with you. I used for maybe like 10 years or 15 years, but yeah, probably before I met you, I developed a manual therapy technique for the tissue. And you can see that the tissue itself can have a state of ventral, sympathetic or dorsal vagus, which means you can have a tissue that's hot, inflamed, and the person can breathe a lot.
You're right on target, because think about what inflammation is. It's the body going into a state of defense. The problem we all have is that people think about cytokines or immune reactions, inflammatory responses, as if they're orthogonal, independent of autonomic function, when in general, they're part of the same system. Either our body is safe or our body's in a state of threat. It's as simple as that. The endocrine system goes with it as well. So when I talk about autonomics, I'm not merely talking about the autonomic nervous system. I'm crossing boundaries, going into the endocrine system, going into the immune system.
Because now when you turn into a dorsal vagus state, you're going to have a release of endorphin, enkephalins, everything goes, you change your physiological state. We feel on the patient that the tissue become cold.
Yeah.
They are super light on the table, and you can feel them. You can feel two things, or they leave, and that's a dissociation. You feel them leaving the body in the side, in the front, in the back, or some of them do the other thing, they shrink and they hide inside. And there's two reactions that I pay attention. One is the dorsal vagus is difficult to feel because nothing happened. They don't breathe. They get light. They fix their eyes on the ceiling. And you ask them to pay attention. Are they leaving? It's usually on the side, with which side? Or are they hiding inside, hiding under the bed, inside the closet, but they're hiding inside the belly often.
Yeah.
And they disappear there. And that's what you feel, for example, in a lot of chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. This reaction, they really shrink inside often. And it's so that's, I apply this directly on the tissue or cellular level.
Yeah. And you can probably, if you interact with them and have them breathe, you can probably reawaken the tissue and get more. It can be more, the tissue becomes more compliant with movement and feels warmer to touch.
I ask them to breathe with only with their mouth, out. Keep their eyes open so they don't. Exactly.
It's amazing that how, in a sense, predictable our body is to threat. It's going, and we make complex narratives trying to say, well, that's not what's happening. But, as an astute therapist, you're there, you're feeling it, and you're anticipating. I'm sure when you interact with a client, you know exactly what's going to happen next in terms of their strategy, their muscle tone of their body.
Well, I could see them. Some people are really, for example, shut down. They don't have good boundary. They're hidden in the back of the room. You expect them to go into dorsal vagal. But, some trauma bring them into fight or flight, and some trauma bring them into immobilization. You never know. Even if globally they look somebody very hyper, and they could go into, immobilization because the trauma was beyond their resource. They were cornered at that moment, and they went into a fight or flight. So I'm just waiting for one or the other.
I think one of the issues is that the movement out of dorsal sometimes results in a triggering of aggression.
I guess they are mixed. They're mixed. Usually, they what they say when you begin to treat them, they say nothing is happening. What are you doing? This is a ridiculous technique. What are you doing? And they don't realize they're totally cold, and slowly they begin to fix the seating, and they, if they are going to their mind to avoid it, they will say, well, nothing's happening. What are you doing? But you have to catch it and see that's not a normal state, and they begin to have many reactions.
Well, I'm sure in your practice, there are a lot of people who are basically numb to their own body. And so when you start asking them how do they feel, it's almost like an open-ended question. They don't totally understand. It's a foreign language. They don't have a language to describe what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I have a tricky question. I just remember it, and I don't know if it's tricky, but if we look at invertebrate, they are supposed to not having, they didn't develop a sympathetic system. So if you look at the Scorpio, invertebrate, exoskeleton, they don't have, vertebrae, or a wasp, they will attack you. Which system do they use to attack you?
You're asking me outside my knowledge range. I was thought you were going to go into octopus, and so in this, the other part when you talk about wasps, I think they're picking. Okay, so in a real life experience a few days ago, a wasp was buzzing around on the porch, and wasps tend not to bother me. They just do their thing, and I do my thing. And I don't worry about them. My wife comes out, she's coming out, and she gets very anxious, and her anxiety, is I pick it up, and I'm sure the wasps do as well. So in a sense, we project a lot of, we use the term energy, but we're projecting in terms of our voice, which is a form of energy, movement, which is another form, and even our body temperature, and who knows what other dimensions of activity we're conveying, whether we are safe or not safe. And I think, invertebrates are picking that up on a more collective level than we do. We're, in a sense, well, we pick it up collectively, we just don't acknowledge it. And that, I guess, is my point. When you have an anxious person in your proximity, it doesn't relax you. You're responding to it.
No, but I mean, you would expect an invertebrate, like a worm. A worm will not attack you and try to bite you. It will only have a reaction of immunization. Why a wasp, a scorpion? Because scorpion come and attack you. You mess up with them.
Oh, you're asking the question of approach versus withdrawal.
Have a reaction that is sympathetic, fight or flight. Why do you expect them not to have a sympathetic system?
I don't know. So, in a sense, there are people who study the EEG patterns of bees. It's a very small brain, but they have a brain. So I don't know. I think, again, it's hard enough to convey information about our very well-known evolutionary history of breaking off from reptiles and what did we do, what was repurposed, and how do we use the existing structures. Now to go into the invertebrate world, which has a totally different culture, meaning it's much more collective, it's much more, the communication systems are very different. I don't know.
So we can assume they have a fight response not related with the sympathetic system.
Not necessarily different. So like I don't know. Okay, so even if we make the shift to plants basically have a nervous system as well, certainly not as advanced as animals, but different. So that like a leaf is injured, the plant responds to that injury, sends chemicals to it, and starts to do a healing process. So there are adaptive features in these systems. Again, the socialization of invertebrates, the area of I would say the fundamental area of neuroscience has really been in humans during the past 20 years, 30 years. And even the area of neurophysiology is, people aren't, they're not physiologists anymore. This is a discussion in our house because my wife is a behavioral endocrinologist or behavioral neuroscientist. And we miss the days of when physiology was viewed as everyone needed to know physiology. So you start having areas like neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience where people don't know anything about areas other than the cortex. And they don't even understand foundational brainstem areas that are survival oriented. They start creating a complex system that they want to study. But what we have some basic principles in our own evolution, and that is there are foundational systems. And this is really where polyvagal theory tries to make its point. It's that the foundational systems are survival oriented. We better get an understanding of those foundational systems before we start studying these higher level systems that sit on top of those foundational circuits. Because when those foundational circuits shift from homeostatic or support to defense, all the systems that are superimposed, the higher level ones, are disrupted. It's a hierarchical system. And contemporary neuroscience doesn't really have a good picture of that. We treat symptoms, we treat specific processes. We tend not to see the trajectory of a disruption of a primary foundational survival system.
So let's talk about that. I know I think you believe that most diseases are diseases of the autonomic nervous system or of the mind.
Well, let's deconstruct what you're saying, because that is a powerful statement you said. So let's say that diseases have an autonomic manifestation, and they have a psychological or mental manifestation. The causality implies a bottom up or top down. In my perspective, things go both directions, and I'm not comfortable with this as putting everything on the bottom up, because let's play around with trauma for a while. Trauma basically distorts our ability to read our own bodily cues, so it becomes a bottom up and then a top down segment.
So let's remind: vagus nerve, 80% sensory, so bottom up, 20% motor from the brain down to the vagus nerve. Right. That's what you try.
Yeah. so the answer, I'll give you an example. I developed an acoustic intervention called the Safe and Sound Protocol, and it utilizes acoustic signals that are reminiscent of how a mother's prosodic voice calms her infant. So it's a computer algorithm placed on vocal music, and it makes it functionally that the body can't reject the intonation sounds. It's wired into us. And so our body's kind of like the crying baby, calm down. What I didn't know when I started to develop this was if you had an adverse, let's say, a trauma history, what would cues of safety do to your body? So cues of safety, according to the model, the body should become accessible and you become calm. But there's an interoceptive feedback loop. So this is now top down. My brain, I'm listening to sound, my brain says it's safe, and now my body goes down and the body starts opening up and I become accessible, which to a person with a trauma history is vulnerability. So through the interoceptive, the body is now calm, and the cues of calmness through a process that's called interoception, which is really the sensory part that we're talking about, come up, and suddenly my body says, got to get out of here. This is dangerous, because being accessible is dangerous. So here's a real life example. A parent who was a refugee from Ukraine was over in Poland, and a Polish psychologist was trying to calm the parents so that they could work with the kids from the horrible activities that are going on there. And so the mother puts on the headset and listens for 46 seconds before she pulls the headphones out and says, I can't be in there, because she came out of a war zone. And when you're in a war zone, what is your physiological state? Protect my child. And now we're giving her cues saying, open up. And so the body reacts to that. And the trauma therapists have found this tool, the Safe and Sound Protocol, as a very useful tool to be titrated, to re-educate the feedback loops that you can be accessible and safe.
So is it a tape that a frequency that you use on your computer, or
it is a program. It's marketed by a company called Unite, UNYTE, and it's the subscription base, and they do trainings, and it's a 5-hour program. Initially, when I designed it, it was supposed to be done in 5 1-hour sessions on 5 sequential days. But when they start to move it in, the trauma therapists who've taught me a lot, when they moved into the world of trauma, and somatic therapists, people who are doing body work, craniosacral type work, they found out that if they use it for like 3 to 5 minutes before their sessions, their clients were more accessible to being touched. But the therapist also taught me that for some people, it has to go very slowly, and the 5 hours could take, 10 sessions or more. They can maybe only do a few minutes a day.
I'm sure. I'm going to tell you something we do. When we work with the brain, the limb system, one thing we did is a level 2, a bit more advanced. We do something crazy, is to reinforce the anterior cingulate gyrus. Mm-hmm. You know about that, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a bird that's more solitary, they have a thinner cortex in their cingulate gyrus. they are more social, they have a thicker cortex. And PTSD, if you have a thicker singular gyrus, especially the anterior part, you will have less chance after trauma to collapse and to withdraw. You can stay more into your social engagement and recover the trauma. And the time when you develop your anterior singular gyrus, it's a time when your mom is going to go from a normal cortex to her own singular gyrus and babble. Babbling is such a downregulating thing, but what happens in adults? So we tell them it's going to be crazy. You're going to go in a different part of your brain, talk to the person, try to put your voice in their singular gyrus, which is basically here. And what happens is adult people initially hate that. I'm an adult, I'm not going to go there with the same problem. And they can slowly accept it and downregulate. And they go inside not only a vulnerable place, but almost a hypnotic place when whatever you're going to tell them is going to go so deep as a suggestion. So we use that time to tell them, you're wonderful, you're such a cute baby. That's what the mom should say. I love you. And babbling is such a powerful tool to reopen some channels that have been shut down. And if you have this strong, if you receive that babbling, and again, it's never too late, you can ask your wife to do it. And actually, I remember a study in Stanford asking why those couples stay 60 or 80 years together. And one of the 5 things they do together, they baby talk.
Well, let me give you a little more on that. Okay. So we did a study. It was recently published using a friend's, actually Ed Tronick, who's a close friend. He has the still face paradigm where you interact with the baby, in this case, the mother, and then the mother freezes their face for two minutes. And then the baby initially is disoriented by that, then reaches out. We're talking about 9-month-old infants. And then sometimes going into tantrum, and then the mother, after 2 minutes, re-engages the baby. Now, what we looked at was the characteristics of the mother's voice on the reunion when she comes back. If her voice was more prosodic, the baby's heart rate went down a lot more than if it was less prosodic, and so did the behaviors of disorganization. So the intonation of the mother's voice, if it's more melodic, the behavior comes down. And when you talk about couples babbling, you're really talking about them is forcing them to use intonation in their voice. Yes. Prosody. So it becomes not the words, but the intonation of the voice.
But you could see you go in a different part of your brain or of your cortex.
Yeah. Well, in my own terminology, and this is polyvagal speak, it's the circuits are basically, I call them neuroception because they're outside of awareness. And it goes, the model is this, that virtually all living organisms have a neuroception of threat. Makes sense. That's the world we were taught about. We all have fight, flight. We all are defensive. We forgot one important thing, and that is mammals have a gift. They have a neuroception of safety. And when you have adults babbling, it's just like mother and infant. You're sending cues of safety that this gift downregulates a threat reaction. This gift enables our body to return to more homeostatic states, meaning health, but also spontaneous social interaction, co-regulation.
So let's define neuroception. So I know it's the implicit interaction of the nervous system. Mm-hmm. Ception is caption, to capture, to grasp. And then you have exteroception, information from outside, historically. Then you have proprioception, and nociception, for pain. And you define neuroception.
Okay, nociception is just one form of a neuroception to threat. And if we interpret it that way, we realize that nociception is going to have all the correlates of fight-flight. It's going to have high sympathetic tone. And that means that one of the ways to downregulate nociception is with the gift, which is to use a neuroception of safety. And this is what is happening in the world of chronic pain. Many people are learning that surgery and medication is not the way, but they're using things like group psychotherapy, where people are in groups, where they talk, where they engage. And there are therapists using the safe and sound protocol to treat chronic pain. And what it is, it shifts the physiological state. Now, this means, if we go back to where we start, you asked me, what is polyvagal theory? I said it was emphasizing that intervening variable, the state of the autonomic nervous system. If we shift the state of the autonomic nervous system from a state of sympathetic dominance, if we can use that term, which keeps us in a state of threat, fight, or flight, supports nociception, to move it into a calmer state, a state that supports co-regulation or calmness in our physiology, pain is greatly reduced and people can manage and live their lives better.
Makes sense, yeah. Now, did you map the nociception using, I imagine amygdala? What system?
My work is not on nociception. So, and my work on neuroception is a construct. It's a construct that basically accepts the fact that there are areas of the higher brain structures of the cortex that are outside the realm of awareness, that are, in a sense, making interpretations of detection, qualitative detection of stimuli. So it incorporates cortical and areas like the perioccipital gray and parts before it gets into the autonomics. It's getting manifested in autonomic response. So neuroception is really interpreted from the autonomic response.
So, the amygdala, Joseph?
The amygdala is the central nucleus of the amygdala is going to be a major player in this, because that's really communicating and organizing the autonomic nervous system. The perioccipital gray is going to organize the motor behavior. And when you have motor behavior, you have to have autonomics. So you have this, let's say, co-organization. I mapped it, I speculated on the mapping. I would like people to go further with it. Yeah. So you have, in a sense, a sketchy model. But the important part of neuroception is that it tries to move the process of responding to risk outside of the realm of perception, which has an ambiguous meaning. People think that it's conscious. And so when they miss something, they feel, I didn't perceive it correctly. And they end up in the world of trauma, especially, as blaming themselves. But if we think in terms of neuroception, we start to respect our gut feelings. We start to respect our body's reaction. So what I often say is that with neuroception, we have functionally no idea initially what the stimulus is, but we have a very good idea of what our body is responding to it.
It's like with amygdala. They say, the amygdala, it goes 800 times faster than the pathway going to consciousness.
Yeah. So it's going to be similar. The amygdala is going to be involved in it, because remember, the amygdala is a collection of nuclei that have different jobs.
125. They are really crazy. We used to say amygdala, and Joseph, we do talk about central median, but there's 5 of them.
And for me, I just sit on the central nucleus because I'm at home there. But we tend to give the amygdala executive function, give it agency as making decisions. And the decisions are really quite reflexive and immediate. And the part that we can become aware of is the feedback from our body. But as our body numbs out due to chronic stress, we're turning off the feedback loops and we're misreading what our body is saying.
So neuroception takes the information from exteroception, interoception, all that, and together.
Well, interoception is, it's not taking it from traditional forms of interoception. So neuroception is really, the word evolved in my thinking because I couldn't use the word perception, because I had wanted to, but then it created so much ambiguity that, that people thought that they have a control over what they're perceiving. And if they miss, it's like a person who was raped or was allowed someone into their space, they get angry at themselves for misreading cues as opposed to understanding that their body was responding appropriately to the cues that were being presented. And sometimes people get gut feelings and they override those. And what neuroception says, there's some validity in your gut feeling, and that may take a moment for you to think about. And so think about it. And if you come up with a narrative that nullifies the importance of it, you're fine. If you can't figure it out, then there may be something you might need a little help with.
So let's come back to most disease is a disease of the nervous system or the mind.
Well, we have to. Okay, I'm going to give you an assignment. Okay. The assignment is to look at Walter Hess's Nobel Prize speech in 1949. It's Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. It's the best foundation for,
Yeah, okay. And he was a Swiss physiologist. And what he was really saying is that actually the opening paragraph of his Nobel Prize speech is the one I love, because it talks about all circuits interacting with other circuits, older ones and newer ones. So you talk about feedback loops nested within feedback loops. And I say that if I use a statement like what he wrote in his Nobel Prize speech in a grant proposal or an article, they would never get published or funded because it would be viewed as too much new age. But it was greatly respecting the fact that we don't have a peripheral or a nervous system and a central one. We have one nervous system. The body talks to the brain or the mind, and the mind talks to the body. It's a bidirectional superhighway. The vagus is an important part of that story. In a sense, one can conceptualize the vagus as being that superhighway of brain-body communication.
So maybe we could complete, because I know you have limited time. Maybe talk about benevolence and vagal abundance and
benevolence.
Yeah, benevolence. Sorry for my French accent.
The French is fine. It's certainly better than my French accent. So, okay, so I think that the qualities that we attribute to a transformed human being, such as benevolence, feeling gratitude, compassion, generosity, all these features are features that can only occur in a physiological state that is safe, that supports homeostatic functions on some level. I think you might find some people who are able to reach that, even though they may have a seriously disrupted nervous system. But in general, the principles of being able to share and interact and co-regulate and connect, we're really talking about connection with other, is dependent upon our physiology not being in a state of threat.
The physical state we're in determine our
yeah, well, or maybe determine is too strong a word. Let's use the word biases. Let's say that our physiology biases how we react to the world. And that if our physiology, so I've been working on this notion, what is feelings of safety, feelings of being safe? What does that mean on a physiological level? Because feelings tend to be not respected in the world of science and medicine. And I came up with the conclusion that feelings of safety are really our autonomic nervous system in a state of homeostasis, projecting that state to our conscious brain. That when our body moves out of homeostasis, physiologically, it's in a state of threat, and we're interpreting it as we become hypervigilant, we are unsafe in the environment. And in the world where you work, you see patients who have comorbidities like fibromyalgia you mentioned. They may have hypertension, their muscles might hypertonicity of the muscles. They may lean forward. They may not be able to here's I would say the metaphor. We talk about ventral vagus, but in a sense, the ventral side gets curled inward and protected. And if we look at mammals, again, look at mammals, ventral side is always the vulnerable side. The back is the shell, hard. And if we think about like a puppy or a kitten, if they go like this on their back, we interpret it as being submissive, but that's not what it is. It's trusting. They trust you that you can touch their ventral side and they will enjoy it and not react. You're not hurting them. It's a sense of trust. And we do that when we show our ventral side to others. We give people hugs. And again, we know that some people want to give hugs, but their bodies say, and they, I'm sure you've had some unusual hugs in your life.
I know in California they used to ask, are you a hugger or not before hugging?
Yeah. But it's meaningful. And what they're really saying is your body, I respect your body. Is your body comfortable in ventral proximity with another? And the answer to that is really clear, that for many people have trauma histories. I mean, far more than we acknowledge. And their bodies are going to be very tentative, very cautious about proximity.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, Stephen, it's a delight always to talk with you. I hope it was just enough time. We learned so much as usual. Anything you are doing in the future? Any new book?
Yeah, well, there are two books in progress. One is with my son. It's basically a readable book. So the idea was, can you make a book on polyvagal theory that everyone could read? And he's a journalist and now a filmmaker by profession. And in terms of the basic science, I've actually been working on a variable that I call vagal flexibility. Vagal efficiency. I should remember what I'm doing. Yeah. So we've been talking about vagal tone. It has been, since overused and measures from heart rate variability. But what I wanted to find out was if I change the vagal influence as measured by that respiratory component in the heart rate pattern, if I depress that, how much does the heart rate itself change? So I can see literally how much bang do I get for the removal of a certain amount of vagal tone? And when do I remove vagal tone? Well, we did this not through a mental effort test, but just shifting posture. So when you shift posture...
I thought you were doing breathing, not even the posture.
No, postures. It's just, so go supine to seated to standing. You can get a real range of heart rate changes. Now you can see, if you do it like 3 minutes in each of those stages, how tightly linked is that measure of cardiac vagal tone to the heart rate. And what's interesting is it's an individual difference, and that people who have symptoms of dysautonomia, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or even trauma histories, their coupling, their heart rate changes and their vagal tone from our respiratory sinus arrhythmia, they're almost orthogonal, unrelated. So the system starts to decouple, meaning that the neural regulation of the vagus is losing its profound impact on the heart, on heart rate. And the way of thinking about this, and this is in a medical model, is in a medical model, we think about organs having disease. In a polyvagal model, we think of the nervous system as regulating the organs. And the precursor to disease is a disruption in that regulation. And vagal efficiency is telling you whether that feedback loop is disrupted using the regulation of the heart as its model. And so dysautonomia is very difficult to treat because it's not a organ damage. It's a neural regulation of the organ problem. And what polyvagal theory hopes to bring into work is more of an awareness that neural regulation of organs is a precursor of organs being diseased, and that you can start developing what I call neural exercises to rehabilitate those feedback loops.
We're going to print T-shirt, live long by your vagal efficiency.
Well, it's an interesting journey, and Interestingly, vagal efficiency is depressed with trauma, depressed with alcohol. It develops in prematurity. You can see it mature. It shows sleep state differences. In Ehlers-Danlos, we could almost identify who had Ehlers-Danlos from a clinic based upon their vagal efficiency. So, and we now did a study on cyclic vomiting, and children who are cyclic vomiters have low vagal efficiency. So all these systems that appear to be unrelated to the heart, meaning gut problems, or muscles, or let's say not muscle, collagen, which is from Ehlers-Danlos, these symptoms are coming back in the neuroregulation of the autonomic nervous system.
I think, well, how many, they have types, 6 or 7 types of Ehlers-Danlos?
Well, we're talking primarily joint hypermobility.
All right, this one, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I don't know, there are different types, and but joint hypermobility is most prevalent, primarily because it's easily identified, whether it's truly Ehlers-Danlos or some other form of joint hypermobility. They just evaluate what joints are hypermobile.
But how efficient would you be just with breathing? Just with those.
I think you can. I think with breathing, you could probably, is doing, let's say, 10 abdominal breaths, 10 shallow breaths. You could probably get some reasonable.
I would think of the long exhale and the short inhale.
Yeah, you could probably get into the system, but I felt that the posture shift took all the intentionality and consciousness out of the evaluation. So and I also have done it with putting a person on an exercise bike, and that worked very well as also. So the point is, if you can just think of something as a physical manipulation, not as a psychophysiological manipulation, and breathing has intentionality, awareness, and embodiment, I think the breathing can be an exercise that would rehabilitate vagal efficiency.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll give you a big ventral hug if you allow it.
I do allow it. Listen, I really enjoyed seeing you again, and it's been a long time. The memories are coming back. So,
blessings on your way. See you very soon, hopefully.
Yes, I hope so.
Lots of success.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Good to see you again.